Hello class, welcome to this lesson 3.4, how to experiment well. So we're going to expound a little bit on experiments, describing how to randomly assign treatments using slips of paper or technology. We're going to explain the purpose of random assignment in an experiment. And then we're going to identify other sources of variability in an experiment, explaining the benefits of keeping the variables the same for the different groups that you use in the experiment. So let's focus on random assignment. So random assignment is essentially when you have your groups, right? You have maybe your control group, your treatment group, whatever groups you have, and you randomly assigned your individuals to a particular group, right? To either one group or the other. So remember that when we focus on the caffeine example, we were measuring caffeine, the effect of caffeine on the pulse rate. So it was mentioned that our control group was the placebo group, right? That's the one that had the caffeine-free cola, right? So, and if you're confused on what we're discussing, this was the example that we looked at in the previous lesson. So, so the placebo, so the not the placebo effect, sorry. So the placebo that was the caffeine-free cola was given to the control group, and when you're designing this experiment, you want to keep in mind that there's a lot of variables that could affect the pulse rate, right? So besides caffeine, you have caffeine tolerance. So if you're someone who maybe drinks a cup of coffee every morning, you might have a caffeine tolerance, right? And at some point, you might need to take in more caffeine to get the same effect. So caffeine tolerance could affect the pulse rate. The person's weight might affect it. There's a lot of variables that come into play. So the idea is that because there's a lot of variables, these variables are known as sources of variability because they affect the variable that we want to measure, right? They change it. So as we mentioned, these are some sort of like the variables that kind of interfere with the results, right? That we're trying to do here. So to control for the sources of variability, such as weight, caffeine rates, and so on, it's important that when you are designing this, that the individuals know or don't know which group that they're being assigned to. So the individuals must be randomly assigned, but they also can't know where they were assigned, right? So they can't know like what treatment they were receiving. So that's important as well. So let's discuss what a random assignment means. We kind of mentioned it, but in the definition, the random assignment means that the experimental units are assigned to treatments using a chance process. The experimental units are the individuals in the study, right? So in this case, they might be human subjects, right? In our case of the cola experiment. So you randomly assign them using a chance device or slips of paper, RNG, whatever, in order to assign them to a treatment or non-treatment group. So let's look at an example. In Mr. Lucco's class, 20 students volunteered to participate in the caffeine experiment. Describe how you would randomly assign 10 students to each treatment. So there are a couple of methods. So let's look at the first one. How would we assign 10 students to each treatment using identical slips of paper? Well, first off, since there's 20 students, you can number them off, right? And that would be like what you would do if you were using a random number generator, right? You kind of give them a number and then select. But if you're doing slips of paper, you could number the slips of paper, 1 and 2, maybe group 1, group 2, and the students can't know which treatment is group 1 and which treatment is group 2. They can't know that, right? They can't know that group 1 means they're in the placebo group, for instance, right? So you could do that. You could say A and B, right? So you have some students in group A, some students in group B, whatever you want to use, okay? So we could have 10 slips of paper with the number 1, right? And 10 slips with the number 2. And I'm putting this in quotes, you know. So they can have number 1 on one of them, number 2 on the other one. Now, number 1 could be the treatment group, number 2 could be the non-treatment group, right? And that'll tell them which group they're in. Okay, so 10 slips with 1, 10 slips with 2. Then you kind of mix the slips of paper because you want to, you want them to be truly random, right? So you're gonna mix the slips of paper and have a student select 1. Select 1 to determine which group they belong, right? To determine their experimental group. Okay, and you do this for all the students, right? So you could have 10 students, you just do this randomly. You might not have 10 right away, right? With the number 1, you have to use up all the slips of paper, and then you have all the students assigned to their groups. Okay, it's important that the slips of paper have to be identical. So there can't be one that's pink and one that's white or yellow, because then you can kind of tell which one has what group, right? Because you can identify them. So using a random number generator, what we could do is we can have the technology assign a number between 1 and 20, right? So we can say, okay, so let the computer or whatever you're using pick a number from 1 to 20. So we can number off the students, right? And then have them go from, each student has a number, so from 1 to 20, and then randomly generate 10 integers from 1 to 20. And then the students that have these numbers can go in one particular group, right? So let it pick a number from 1 to 20. Or let's say let's say pick 10 numbers, right? 10 numbers from 1 to 20. And let the students who have been assigned those numbers, so you have to assign the students the numbers, to go into one of the groups. And then you can say that the other 10 students will automatically go into the default group. So the other 10 students go into the other group. Okay, so there's different ways that you can randomize this, but the idea is we're trying to figure out how can we randomize this sort of process, right? So let's take a look at the purpose. So why do we do random assignments? Well, the reason why we do random assignments is that random assignments make it so that, remember that we mentioned that there's a lot of different variables, right? So weight is a consideration. You have caffeine intake is if you're a regular caffeine intake person, right? So you're someone that regularly consumes caffeine, that might affect your pulse rate if you intake a certain amount of caffeine. So all these variables kind of influence the result. And so what we want to do is we want to randomly assign people so that these effects kind of cancel out, right? So since these variables have impact on the experiments, we can average the effects of all of these so that the control and the treatment groups are roughly equivalent. And then therefore it kind of eliminates the issue. But remember that for this to work, you have to have enough subjects, right? So if the sample size is too small, then it might not, this randomization might not be enough to kind of cancel out some of these differences that you see. in the study. So that's something important to realize, that your sample size has to also be large enough. You can't just have randomization. So randomization alone is not sufficient. You have to have a large sample size. All right, so let's look at an example. So many people blame TV for the increasing problem of obesity. Does the type of program influence how much people eat? So according to a recent study, the answer is yes. 94 college students were randomly assigned to one of 3 treatments: watching 20 minutes of a Hollywood action movie, watching the same 20-minute excerpt of the movie with no sound, and watching 20 minutes of an interview program. While watching, participants were given snacks and allowed to eat as much as they wanted. Subjects who watched a highly stimulating excerpt from The Island ate 65% more calories than subjects who watched the interview program Charlie Rose. Participants who watched the silent version of The Island ate 46% more calories than those who watched Charlie Rose. So we want to explain the purpose of the random assignment in this context. So why they so if we were to randomly assign these, we want to see what purpose that would serve. So in order to explain the effect of random assignment in this case, let's explain what would happen if we didn't have random assignment. So if we didn't have random assignment, that would mean that the participants can choose which movie they would want to watch. Now, if they do that, then that basically turns into sort of a voluntary response, right? Where they volunteer to pick a certain movie to watch, and then because they did that, you might have the same type of person watching the same type of movie. So, for instance, what if gender played a role in this example? So, what if more males wanted to watch the action movie? Well, in that case, if more men wanted to watch the action movie and they were allowed to do so, then you might have a confounding a variable, which would be gender in this case, right? So there are tons of reasons why we don't want we don't want the lack of randomization. So randomization helps control for these sort of things. Okay, so remember that the purpose purpose, let's go back to here. We want to make sure. Okay, so the purpose of randomization is to allow for groups that are roughly the same, right? As far as characteristics, right? And so if you don't allow the randomization aspect, then there's going to be more, we're going to increase in bias, essentially. You're going to have maybe more males watching the action movie. And so there might be an effect that males might intake more calories, right? We might have that variable, that sort of observation taking place, and we don't want that, right? We want to be able to isolate the cause, and so we want to eliminate that gender aspect. So it's to allow the groups that are to allow for groups that are roughly the same. So if you allow people to choose the movie, to choose the treatment, I guess. Well, in this case, we'll say choose the movie. This allows for the possibility of confounding variables. So the possibility of confounding variables, i.e., males might prefer the action movie, which in this case which could make it difficult to determine if the calorie consumption was due to diet, or was due to not diet, the program was due to the TV program, or was it due to something else, maybe gender. So this is just an example, of course. There might be some other variables at play that would enable people to choose a certain film, and then therefore might influence the result. So let's look at other sources of variability. Remember that the purpose of random assignment is to eliminate the sources of variability, such as the weight, caffeine tolerance, and so on. So there are other sources of variability which can be controlled, and these are the other sources that we want to discuss. So for example, these are things that we can control in an experiment. So the amount of soda or the amount of sugar. So these are things that you want to also consider. Remember that the purpose of an experiment is to control these, of a well-designed experiment is to control these variables so that we can prevent confounding and then reduce any changes in the response variable, maybe due to sugar or other things, right? So we want to reduce that by keeping all the variables constant. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That's a good rule of thumb when you're designing for a well-designed experiment, is that every variable has to be constant except for what you're trying to witness the effect of. Okay, so let's look at another example. So in the TV and snacks example that we looked at earlier, researchers determined that the people typically consume more calories when watching TV shows with more distractions. Identify one variable that the researchers kept the same for all subjects during the experiment. Provide 2 reasons why it was important for the researchers to keep this variable the same. So notice in the previous, in the example that we just looked at prior to, in this example, they watched all groups watched, regardless of which movie they watched for 20 minutes, right? Before they looked at their consumption and calories, the difference in consumption, right? So they kept the time, the duration of, how long the amount of time that they were watching, right? So sort of in the experiment, the amount of time spent watching each program or watching the program was kept constant, right? Was kept constant at 20, I believe it was 20 minutes, right? So kept about 20 minutes. So that was the one variable that they kept the same, right? So why did they do this, right? So the reason why did they want to do this is because they wanted to eliminate the possible source of confounding, right? In which, what if time also had to do with why people consume more calories, right? Maybe if you're watching TV longer, you might consume more calories, right? So we want to eliminate that. We don't want the amount of time to change between the programs as well, right? We don't want people to choose to watch as little as much as they want, because then if they do that, then you're not sure whether it was a time or whatever. So whether it was time or it was the program. Okay, so the first sort of reason we'll discuss is that if the time wasn't constant, right? So if the time wasn't constant, we wouldn't be able to discern whether the calorie consumption was due to the time watched, so the time, or due to the program. Okay, so the other thing is we also don't want them to eat as or to watch as much or little as they want. We don't want the individuals to control the amount of time watched, right? The amount of time spent watching. Because this could potentially lead, right? This could lead to, so this could lead to like a wide variation in calories, right? So what if they spend less time watching TV and therefore they consume less calories, right? Or what if they spend more time and then they consume more calories? How do we tease out the effects of time if we allow them to adjust the time that they watch the TV, right? So this could lead to a wide variation, potentially, right? That's potentially to a wide variation in calorie consumption.